Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be taking a look at Donald Trump.
Oh, okay.
You know, he's always in the news.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've got some really interesting source material for this one. You sent us excerpts from Wikipedia and also from the White House archives. It's really interesting to see, the two different perspectives.
Yeah, that is interesting. Kind of one's like a very official record,
Exactly.
and then the other is more like how do I put it? Like a living document, with lots of different people contributing to it.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a pretty wild story, too.
Yeah.
I mean, just skimming through these sources, I was
Mhm.
blown away by some of the things I found. Like, did you know that Trump filed for bankruptcy 6 times?
6 times.
Six times for his businesses between 1991 and 2009.
Oh, wow.
Big properties like the Plaza Hotel and his casinos in Atlantic City.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. But I mean,
Yeah.
some people say those bankruptcies were actually pretty smart moves for him. Like he was able to use them to kind of restructure his debt, get rid of things that weren't making money,
Oh, interesting.
and minimize his own personal losses.
So like a calculated risk, kind of?
Yeah, exactly. Although you have to wonder how those bankruptcies affected his relationships with banks, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I mean, after 6 bankruptcies,
Right.
would any bank want to work with him again?
Well, apparently a lot of the big banks became really hesitant to lend to him after those bankruptcies, especially the ones in the early 90s.
Hmm.
But there was one bank that became his main lender for a while, Deutsche Bank.
Deutsche Bank.
Yeah. Although even they cut ties with him after January 6th.
Wow. It really makes you think about the long-term consequences of those financial decisions.
For sure.
But, okay, let's back up a little bit. How did he even build his empire in the first place? I was surprised to find out that he actually got his start in real estate working for his father's company,
Oh, that's right.
Trump Management, back in 1968.
Yeah, that's a really important period to understand, like, his whole approach to business. I mean, that's when we start seeing those early legal battles popping up. Like, there were those allegations of racial discrimination in their rental practices.
Yeah, wasn't there even a lawsuit?
Yeah, the U.S. government actually sued Trump management over those charges.
Oh, wow.
Trump ended up settling the case, but he never actually admitted to any wrongdoing.
Interesting.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Over 4,000 legal actions in total.
You're kidding?
Nope, that's what the sources say. Over 4,000.
Wow, 4,000 legal actions. It seems like he's always pushing the limits, always ready for a fight.
It's like a pattern, right?
Yeah.
Like those early legal battles, they kind of foreshadow some of the controversies that came up later in his career.
So that's a good point.
Makes you wonder how all those experiences shaped his views on, like, legal boundaries, and his willingness to kind of challenge the rules.
Okay, so we've got this businessman who's not afraid of a fight, who's willing to take risks, and who seems to be constantly embroiled in legal battles. How does that translate into a political career?
That's where things get really interesting. Like, even when he was still focused on business, you can see these early hints of political ambition. Did you know he actually switched parties several times?
Really?
Yeah, he went from Republican to Democrat to Independent.
Wow. It's like he was testing the waters, trying to find the right fit.
Exactly. And then there was that whole thing with the Reform Party back in 2000, remember?
Oh, yeah, he ran in their primary, didn't he?
He did. And there were even rumors that he was thinking about running for president in 2012 against Obama.
Hmm. So the idea of being president was something he had been thinking about for a long time.
Yeah, it seems like he was always kind of simmering in the background, even when he was doing all those other things like
Yeah.
business and reality TV.
And then, boom, 2016 happens.
Yeah.
This political outsider, this businessman with no real political experience, he wins the presidency. It's crazy.
It was totally unprecedented. I
Yeah.
mean, the media attention was insane. His statements were always provocative, and nobody really expected him to win.
So what do you think were the key factors that led to his victory? Because he kind of broke all the rules of politics.
It was a perfect storm, really. You had Hillary Clinton's lead in the polls shrinking,
Right.
and then there was this general feeling among some voters that they were unhappy with the way things were going.
They want to change.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have Trump, who was just like a master of getting media attention.
He got so much free media coverage, didn't he?
He did. It was incredible. It's like he was born for the 24-hour news cycle. All those
Yeah.
provocative statements, his unconventional behavior, it was all catnip for the media.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, of course, there were his campaign promises. Building a wall, renegotiating NAFTA, cracking down on immigration. Those ideas really connected with some voters.
Yeah, especially the immigration policies. Those were really controversial, both during the campaign and throughout his presidency.
Yeah, we're talking about the travel ban and the separation of families at the border.
Exactly. Those policies sparked huge debates and legal challenges. They really highlighted how deeply divided the country was becoming.
Wow, so from boardrooms to the Oval Office, it's been quite a journey.
It really has.
And I have a feeling this deep dive is about to get even more intense as we move into his time as president.
Oh, yeah. Things are about to get really interesting now because, as president, all those patterns we talked about earlier, the risk-taking, the legal battles, the challenging of norms, it all plays out on a much bigger stage.
I can't wait to dig in.
Neither.
So let's get into his time as president. We were just talking about those immigration policies, but there's a whole lot more to cover.
It was a wild ride, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely a lot of headline-making moments. Let's see, where should we start? Okay, what about his key policy actions? Things like the tax cuts, the attempts to repeal Obamacare, his focus on energy independence, and that big increase in military spending. A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, it's a pretty diverse agenda.
It is. What ties it all together, do you think?
Well, you can definitely see those conservative economic ideas at play, but there's also that focus on, like, American power. And of course, there's that populist appeal to his base. But each policy had its own consequences, some good, some not so good.
Okay, let's break some of that down. Let's start with those tax cuts. That was a big win for him,
Oh,
right?
definitely. It was a major part of his economic plan. His supporters said those cuts would boost the economy, help businesses grow, and benefit everyone. But his critics said, that they would mostly help the rich and make income inequality worse.
And what about Obamacare? He tried so many times to get rid of it.
He did, didn't he?
Had it never happen.
Yeah, getting rid of Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, as it's officially known.
Right.
It was like his obsession. He said it was a broken system, that it was driving up healthcare costs and giving people fewer choices. But a lot of people disagree with him, including some in his own party, and all of those attempts to repeal and replace it, they all failed.
It seems like healthcare was a constant battle during his presidency.
It definitely was. And then you've got climate change, which is becoming a more and more pressing issue.
Yeah, and his environmental policies were really controversial, weren't they?
Definitely. Pulling out of the Paris Agreement, rolling back all those environmental regulations, and constantly downplaying the whole issue of climate change, even questioning the science behind it. A lot of people were really upset about that.
Yeah, environmental groups and world leaders were furious. But his supporters said he was putting America's economic interests first, getting rid of all those regulations that were holding businesses back.
That's right. So you've got that constant tension between economic growth and protecting the environment. And it was a theme that kept coming up throughout his presidency.
It's like he was always trying to undo everything Obama had done.
There was definitely a sense of that, yeah.
Yeah.
Like rolling back Obama's policies was a top priority for him, whether it was healthcare, the environment, or foreign policy deals like the Iran nuclear deal. He had a very different vision.
Okay, speaking of foreign policy, his approach was very different from other presidents, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. He was much more confrontational, more focused on making deals, less interested in working with other countries. He slapped tariffs on China, pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, and got into those, Twitter wars with Kim Jong-un. It was a pretty dramatic shift.
It was a wild time for global politics. It felt like anything could happen. But back home, it wasn't just about policy. There were all those scandals and investigations, too.
Oh, yeah. There was always some kind of controversy brewing.
Right. It felt like every other week there's a new bombshell.
His presidency was never boring, that's for sure. You had the Mueller investigation, which was huge.
Right, that loomed over his entire presidency.
And then there were all the other investigations into his business dealings, his personal life, his campaign finances.
Okay, let's talk about the Mueller investigation for a minute. What were the key takeaways from that whole thing? Because it went on forever.
It did, didn't it?
Yeah, years and years.
It was a really pivotal moment. They were looking into Russian interference in the 2016 election.
Right, everyone was talking about that.
And they were trying to figure out if the Trump campaign had worked with Russia to influence the election. And, what did they find? Well, they concluded that Russia did interfere in the election.
In a big way.
In a sweeping and systematic fashion, as they put it.
Wow, so they confirmed what a lot of people had suspected?
Yeah, but they didn't find enough evidence to say that there was an actual criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia.
Okay, so not exactly a smoking gun.
Nope. But the report also didn't clear Trump when it came to obstruction of justice.
So kind of a mixed bag then.
Yeah, and it led to a lot of debate about what it all meant. Trump said it proved he was innocent. His critics said it showed he had done something wrong.
And then came the first impeachment,
Right.
Impeached by the House, but acquitted by the Senate. It was incredibly divisive.
It really was.
Yeah.
Democrats mostly wanted to impeach him. Republicans mostly didn't. It all stemmed from those allegations that he had tried to pressure Ukraine into investigating Joe Biden.
So even with all these investigations and controversies going on, he was already gearing up for the 2020 election.
Yeah, the 2020 election was always looming in the background. And, as we get further into this period, we'll see how those tendencies of his, the challenging of norms and pushing boundaries, they come into play in even bigger ways.
Okay, before we get into that, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the high turnover in his administration. 4 White House chiefs of staff. That's got to be some kind of record.
It was definitely unusual. All that staff turnover, along with the scandals and investigations, it created this sense of chaos and instability. It felt like things were always on edge.
And yet he still had a lot of loyal supporters.
He did. His base was incredibly loyal throughout his entire presidency. How do we explain that?
Yeah.
Well, I think it was a combination of factors. He tapped into this feeling of anxiety among a certain group of voters, mostly white working-class voters, who felt like they were being left behind.
Left behind by globalization, by social change.
Exactly. He was the outsider, the one who promised to shake things up, to drain the swamp, as he put it. He was the one who said he would fight for the forgotten man against a corrupt system. And that message really resonated with a lot of people, even if it turned off a lot of others too. His presidency was incredibly polarizing. It showed just how deeply divided the country really is. And unfortunately, those divisions only got worse in the lead up to the 2020 election and its aftermath.
We were talking about how divided the country was, and then 2020 hit, an election year like no other, with that whole COVID pandemic happening.
Yeah, the pandemic really shook things up, didn't it?
Ah.
Changed everything about how campaigns worked, how people voted,
It really did.
and then Trump's whole approach to handling the pandemic.
Yeah, that became a huge issue in the election. And, you know, his approach was really controversial, to say the least. Remember how he downplayed the virus at the beginning?
Oh, yeah, I remember.
And all that talk about unproven treatments?
Yeah.
It often felt like he was going against what the experts were saying.
It did, didn't it? It was a really different approach compared to like a lot of other world leaders who were taking a more cautious, science-based approach.
Right. And then there was all that back and forth about masks and social distancing,
Yeah, his messaging was all over the place.
which just fueled the political divide even more.
It did.
Some people saw those measures as like government overreach, and others saw them as absolutely necessary to keep people safe.
Right, exactly.
So you had this really intense political climate, a pandemic going on, and an election where a lot of people were voting by mail because of safety concerns.
Yeah, it was a recipe for disaster.
It really was. And then when Trump lost to Biden,
Well,
he refused to concede,
Yeah.
and he kept saying the election was rigged, even though there was no real evidence to back that up.
those claims of a rigged election really took hold among his supporters.
They did, and it was amplified by certain media outlets, too.
Right.
Which just made things worse, you know? It eroded people's trust in the whole system.
It did.
And all of that led to January 6th, the attack on the Capitol.
Yeah, that was a dark day.
It was a terrifying day, an attack on American democracy, fueled by Trump's rhetoric and his attempts to overturn the election results.
It was shocking to see something like that happen in our country.
It was, and it led to his second impeachment, even though he was acquitted again by the Senate.
Yeah.
But January 6th really tarnished his legacy, I think. It made people question how fragile our democracy really is.
It did. It showed how dangerous misinformation can be, how divided we are as a country, and how important it is to protect those democratic norms that we sometimes take for granted.
Yeah, and you know what's crazy? Even after all that, he still had a lot of power.
He did, didn't he?
He was holding rallies, endorsing candidates, still shaping the Republican Party's agenda.
His influence didn't disappear overnight.
It didn't, and a lot of Republicans adopted his ideas and his style.
Yeah, Trumpism became a movement of its own, almost bigger than Trump himself.
Exactly. And then he announced he was running for president again in 2024.
Which, I mean, I don't think anyone was really surprised.
No, but it was definitely concerning for a lot of people
It was.
because he was still pushing that rigged election narrative.
Yeah, and he kept attacking democratic institutions.
It felt like he was undermining the very foundations of our democracy.
It did. And then there were those assassination attempts on him during the campaign. Remember those?
Oh, yeah, the one in Pennsylvania where he was grazed by a bullet.
Yeah, and the other one in Florida.
It was terrifying. It felt like things were spiraling out of control.
It showed how volatile the political climate had become.
But even with all of that, and with all the legal troubles he was facing, he still managed to win the Republican nomination. With J.D. Vance as his running mate.
It's really incredible when you think about it. He had all this baggage, all these controversies, but he still had this incredibly strong appeal to a large segment of the population.
Yeah. It's like people either loved him or hated him.
It really was. He represented a kind of defiance against the establishment, a voice for people who felt like the system wasn't working for them. And those feelings are powerful even if you don't agree with his methods.
So, where does that leave us? What's the takeaway from all of this? It's been quite a deep dive.
It has.
It feels like Trump's story is a warning about how fragile democracy can be.
Yeah, it shows how easily things can be disrupted, how quickly norms can be eroded.
And how dangerous political polarization can be.
Definitely. And how powerful personality-driven politics can be.
It's a story about how trust can be broken, how misinformation spreads, how extremism takes root. And it's not over yet. We don't know how it's all going to end.
That's true. We're
Right.
still living it.
We are. We've gone from his days as a businessman to reality TV to presidency. We've looked at his legal problems, his policies, his rhetoric, his impact on everything. It's a complicated story with a lot of layers.
It really is. And remember, this is just one way of looking at it. There are many other perspectives out there.
That's right. And a huge thank you to you, our listener, for sending us these incredible sources. They really helped us see this whole thing from different angles, understand how complex it all is.
We really appreciate it. And we encourage you to keep exploring this topic, to learn more, to hear different viewpoints, and to talk about it with others. Because the future of our democracy depends on all of us being informed and engaged.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with something to think about. How do you think Trump's actions and his words will continue to shape American politics and society in the years to come, whether he's in office or not?
That's a great question. It's something we all need to consider. Because how we answer that question might determine the future of our country. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey.